I swore to myself as a high school boy, I am never going to own real estate. And then lo and behold, here I am, neck deep in real estate.
Welcome to the Freedom Point Real Estate Podcast, where we talk about creating more time freedom through passive real estate investing. Passive investing in real estate challenges conventional investment wisdom. We are passionate about learning and sharing resources with others who are ready to transform their investing mindset. Quick disclaimer as always, I am not a CPA, I am not an attorney or a financial advisor. This is not financial advice, not telling you or anyone else what to do. The views and opinions expressed in these podcasts are provided for education and informational purposes only and are not necessarily the views of my employer, ADP. I'm glad you're here. Now let's dig in. All right, welcome back, Freedom Point Podcast listeners. Thank you again for jumping into another episode of the Freedom Point. I'm your host, Jeremy DYER, and today I have with me Jacob Mueller. Jacob, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jeremy. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give my listening audience a little bit of a bio on Jacob before we get started. Jacob is a short-term rental property manager and owner with 175 properties and is dedicated to helping others achieve financial freedom through short-term rental investments. He's bootstrapped the company while managing 200 plus real estate transactions and scaling towards a goal of 1,000 owners served. Jacob, I don't have too many folks on the podcast that are, resident experts in the short-term rental space. So maybe you can give our listening audience a little bit more color on maybe your background and what you're currently focused on today.
Sure, absolutely. I'll keep it short. I first got into real estate probably about 5 or 6 years ago, but prior to that, I was actually in high school, and my father purchased some pretty crummy apartment buildings. You could say class C minus, perhaps. And I was the go-to turnover guy. So I was there cleaning up all the cigarette smoke, working on this hard black tar rooftop in the heat of summer in Colorado, mowing the lawn. And I swore to myself as a high school boy, I am never going to own real estate. And then lo and behold, here I am, neck deep in real estate. But I didn't really begin my career professionally up until about 4 or 5 years ago when I became a broker. And I actually started in the commercial real estate space as a leasing agent for a small boutique firm. So I was cold calling, getting tenants to fill our clients' buildings. That's how I got started, learned it was not for me. And then I quickly pivoted to residential investment real estate brokerage. And I helped clients kind of find, add value, and manage their long-term rental properties, actually, or their flips. And through that process, I came across a couple of individuals who are now my partners and very good friends of mine. And we formed Renjoy. And I learned a lot about the short-term rental space from those guys and saw a huge opportunity, not just because of the peak era in which they were doing Airbnbs, which I'm sure many of your listeners are aware of, 2021 through 2023, crazy years for short-term rentals, but even learned a lot of things because they had been in there prior to kind of those crazy years. And now we're in those post years. And so we all came together and formed Renjoy and found a pretty big market fit. I mean, we've grown from, 15 listings of our own portfolio to 175 in 2 years under management. So we've grown very quickly.
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate that background. It sounds to me like, you did have some experience on the active side of managing, a real estate portfolio, although at the time it really wasn't yours. It was probably somebody else's, right? But that allowed you to kind of cut your teeth in the industry. And then you pivoted to, the real estate leasing space to further your knowledge in the space. So just out of curiosity, why did you decide, short-term rentals or, Airbnbs as opposed to, maybe other asset classes that exist out there?
That's a great question, Jeremy. I think intuitively, I couldn't tell you that I consciously thought about this because when I made this decision, I had quite a bit less business experience than I do now. But I think subconsciously, I realized there was a lot more opportunity to create value in the short-term rental management space in particular because that industry is so nascent. Like it's new. And I think we are in this phase over the next, probably started a couple of years ago, and through like the next decade, I would say, we're going to see increasing professionalization of the short-term rental industry. In fact, what it used to be called and what it's still called by many is the vacation rental industry. And there's a lot of nuance on like what's happening within this industry and what's changing. And I identified, or I guess in my gut, I identified that there's a lot of opportunity to be a part of that professionalization. And so that's really what attracted me to this particular segment of the real estate industry.
Yeah, it makes total sense. Now let's talk about this bootstrapping concept, right? I'm pretty sure that most successful companies and organizations, businesses, et cetera, start by bootstrapping their operations. So curious to know about kind of some of those early days as you guys just kind of got started, and what were some of the biggest challenges you faced, and how'd you overcome them?
Yeah, there's quite a few questions in there. I'll try to unpack them. I have to take a step back in my history a little bit to understand why I personally valued bootstrapping. And after college, I worked for myself. I had my own first, little endeavor into entrepreneurship. Did pretty poorly, but learned a lot about myself and about the business world. But after that, kind of that business failed, I went to work for a software company. And in that software company, I got to learn a lot. I got to rub shoulders with the CEO of that company. I learned a lot about his way of thinking. And two really big things I learned from that individual. His name is Vance Brown, awesome guy. And I learned two big things. One, exponential thinking, focus on opportunities that have the opportunity to be exponential, not linear. And then the second is bootstrap. And the reason you bootstrap, there are many, but some of the reasons why you choose to bootstrap is because you have to become the CEO you want to be for a larger company by making really hard decisions about resource allocation. If you're not bootstrapping, the decisions around resource allocation don't really affect you right away. It takes a long time. If you raise $1 million, it takes a while to burn through that $1 million, and you're not going to learn how to most appropriately spend each one of those dollars. When you bootstrap, you are clinging on to every dollar. You're thinking very carefully about where your money's going. What is the next best thing I could spend this dollar on? And if you don't bootstrap, you'll never learn that. So that's kind of how I got into that approach.
It makes total sense. I mean, I think about, you've got to have a certain degree of attention, and you've really got to have your fingers, on all of the pluses and minuses, right? No rock can really go unturned, and you've got to be, wholly involved in your business, as opposed to, if you were scaling up and leveling up, not bootstrapping, you'd probably have, third parties involved, maybe assistants involved. You'd be hiring other employees to kind of fill, some gaps and some holes. But when you're the guy, the buck stops with you. And so you've really got to be, wholly involved in all aspects of the business. So I appreciate that.
That's exactly right. And you learn really intimately the details of your business, the margins, how to improve margins, where are the biggest pain points at this point in time. When you see every dollar, you definitely learn a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about this 175 properties. That's impressive, and I would assume a relatively short period of time, comparison to maybe your peers. What are some systems and strategies that are essential to handling that amount of volume effectively?
Yeah, Jeremy, I can't say that I have a great answer for this. What I'll say is my partners are amazing. And one of my partners, his name is Michael. He worked in the oil and gas industry. He's an engineer, systems guy by heart, super smart dude. And I would really kind of lay our success to the partnership that me and my two partners have. Luke's the other one. He's an amazing people person, just really, really good at caring for people and managing relationships well. And the reason why we've been able to have this growth, I think fundamentally, is because of our partnership. Now, I don't know how repeatable that is. I'm not sure of what value that is to your listeners, but the partnership is really our secret ingredient. I really believe that, not just in getting us to where we are, but in getting us over the next several years to that 1,000 owner mark and 2,000 properties under management.
I personally think that was a great answer. I mean, the power of partnerships, right? If you're going to level up, scale up, grow up, all those kind of things, and you need to leverage other people, you've clearly, it sounds like, found some partners in your organization that maybe fill some gaps that you have, either bandwidth or talent, interest, that sort of thing. So I think it's a great answer. But now my next one is, your plan is not to stop at 175. I mean, you're going to 1,000, right? So, what strategy are you planning to deploy to really scale up your business
Mm-hmm.
without compromising, quality of service to your tenants?
Yeah, great question. And I'll point out, this is for all of the folks out there who either hire property managers or have property managers in some capacity. It's very important to understand property managers have two stakeholders, right? They have you, the property owner. They care a lot about you. They care about your asset. They want you to be happy. They also have the tenant, who's another stakeholder that they have to care for. They have to make happy because the tenant's paying the bills. And so there's always this dance the property manager has to play where you're representing your stakeholder over here, the homeowner, but also the tenant over here, and ensuring they have a good experience and they're paying top dollar, and you as the owner are earning as much revenue as possible. I just want to put that as a side note. One of the things that you said, Jeremy, I think is really crucial as I think about growth, and I'm sure you've said this before on your podcast, always start with the end in mind. So when we were thinking about building this business, originally it was just going to be us managing our own portfolio, just a holding company. Yeah, the operating company would be inside of it, but really we were kind of going to go do our own things, but have this shared holding company and operating company for real estate investments. But pretty quickly after, we did that, people started asking us to manage their property. And so we sat down, we spent a good amount of time. It's fun looking back at these photos actually of us at a coffee shop, really brainstorming. We use EOS as kind of our operating system as a business, and we're like going through the book together. It's fun to look back at those notes because we said, if we're going to do this, what do we want it to be? And we want it to be a business of scale that has real impact on improving people's financial lives. And so that's where we set the 1,000 owners, the $200 million in distributions to our owners as our two main targets. Now, this is a long-winded way of saying, in order to be that big and to operate it efficiently at that level, you have to lay some really different groundwork than somebody who's going to manage 175 properties. And so one of the things we did very differently is we have thought about data very differently than most folks in our industry. And I'll give you a really clear example of that. In our industry, most people have, and long-term property managers have what's called a PMS, a property management software. And a vast majority of managers, like AppFolio is one you may be familiar with, or for you long-term rental managers out there, I'm sure you're familiar with AppFolio. We have other ones in the short-term rental space, but it's the key system of record for most property managers. And we think about that very differently. We actually have kept our system of record in something called Airtable, just a no-code database. And we did that very intentionally so that we could switch our PMS and have a lot more control over our data. And what that's done is it allowed us to get a lot more insight into our business and to make our business much more scalable as well.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And if you want to be big, you got to act big, kind of a thing, right? Or make big decisions. So appreciate that kind of glimpse under the or behind the curtain, under the hood, et cetera. Are there any other specific, kind of key metrics or KPIs that you manage, daily, weekly, monthly to ensure, the success and profitability of your short-term rental properties?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a lot of things that we measure. In fact, one of the things I've been thinking about consciously as the CEO recently is dialing back how many things we measure. I know that might sound odd to some folks, but we measure so much and we have such good data that it can actually blur the lines of what's important. And so, for example, key things in our industry is RevPAR. That is the combination of your occupancy for your short-term rental property with the daily rate of your short-term rental property. Many people will talk about occupancy. Many people will talk about your daily rate. And most people should be talking about RevPAR, which is simply the multiplication of those two things, total revenue over time. That's a really key metric. Related to that metric, Jeremy, and this one's a little more nuanced. I don't want to go too far into the weeds because there's a lot to explore here. But we apply something called a pacing report, which is simply how booked were we at this property this time last year looking forward. And that pacing report, we then take and we compare to the market. And we say, hey, are we pacing ahead of the market or are we pacing behind the market? And using that information, we then determine what are we going to price this rental at in order to maximize the RevPAR of the market today, because the markets are never the same. In long-term rentals, the marketplace says rent is $1,400 a month. Maybe you can get $50 more, $50 less, but it's $1,400 a month. Short-term rentals are not like that. They're a lot more like the hotel industry with high variability in prices between two competitors that could be literally across the street.
What's the greatest risk present to you, and or your investors in the short-term rental space?
That's a great question. I think we're experiencing this in one of our marketplaces right now. So we're based out of Colorado Springs, but we manage in several markets. One of them is Woodland Park. And the biggest risk is regulatory risk. In Woodland Park, in fact, there have been short-term rental permit rules in place for years, and permits have been distributed by the city, taxes have been collected by the city, and they recently rescinded that permitting process a year ago or so, and basically said, nope, no more short-term rentals. You guys have a year to wrap them up, but they're not allowed anymore. And because that was so egregious, in fact, because they'd already given the right to rent out these properties in this manner, and that the use was approved by the city, there's actually an alliance of short-term rental property owners who have sued the city. Currently, the case is in the federal court as well as the state court of Colorado, and I suspect we will win that. However, I always tell investors, if there are no rules at all, be very careful. Be very careful. If there are rules, you have much better protection, obviously, if you play by the rules.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So, outside of that regulatory risk that you talked about, are there any other approaches that you use when determining, property selection, market analysis, when advising new investors in the short-term rental space?
Yeah, absolutely. As I'm sure many of your listeners are free market aware of the free market, we look very closely at supply and demand. And so one of the key metrics we look at when an investor comes to us and says, hey, I've got $500,000. I want to maximize a return. I want exposure to real estate, and I even want exposure to short-term rental income. Great. We recommend this particular asset class right now because in our marketplace, we see a dearth of supply of this kind of short-term rental. And so and it's also very difficult, right? One of the things I love about this industry actually is the regulation. I know I talked about how that was the greatest risk, but it's also one of the greatest benefits and what I love about it because I have a government moat around my investment. As long as you play by the rules, the government is reducing supply or making supply addition very slow. And so I actually really like that because constraints on supply while demand grows, which it is growing. Demand for short-term rentals, vacation rentals is growing pretty rapidly. And so I just really like that supply is constrained. And we advise our owner or investors who want to own property in a particular location, buy what there's a little supply of, and that will vary.
Yeah, that makes sense, Jacob. So, talking to that person that's maybe, new to short-term rentals or the STR space, what are some common mistakes to avoid and, how can they prepare to enter the market successfully?
Yeah, I'll say there's two main mistakes that we see, Jeremy, and obviously we see a very select few of folks in this industry. We don't see everybody. And I would say that there's two main ones. One, the investor doesn't consider the importance of the operator enough. They think it's very similar. Oftentimes successful long-term real estate investors or successful real estate investors, but who haven't been in the short-term rental space, who have a lot of sophistication, have a lot of knowledge, think that they can operate it or go about what they've known to do to have success, and they don't realize how big a deal the operator is. And so one big mistake they make is they don't bring the operator in soon enough. I'll give you an example, actually, if we have time. We have a friend or a client of ours, actually, who bought a motel. It was probably about a 38 unit. I think it was like 38 to 45 units, something like that, motel in Colorado Springs. And they were remodeling every room, and they were doing rent by week. They were doing a very traditional hotel or motel model on how they were going to operate that asset. Well, they were halfway through renovating these rooms, and they're like, you know what? We're doing okay, but not as good as we want to be. Would you guys take a look at managing this for us? So we come in, we take a look around, and we were like, hey, guys, if you had brought us in when you first bought this asset, we could double your NOI, at least, if not triple it. But you brought us in too late. You've spent too much capital. The way you're renovating these rooms are not optimized for what we would do. And at this point, you're too far in. Like, just run it as a traditional motel investment. We're not going to be able to operate this for you. That's a good example of somebody who lost out on quite a bit of value because they brought us in too late. And then another one is related to that, Jeremy. Another big mistake we see: you hire the wrong operator. So maybe you value the operator, you bring them in, but you hire the wrong one. And we see this a lot because we get a lot of folks transitioning from other property managers to our services. And it's a very costly mistake. And the short-term rental industry is not the same. In long-term rentals, you can switch property managers, very little cost to you as the owner. With short-term rentals, because each operator operates very differently, there can be a lot more expense in switching. So be very careful with who you hire initially.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's obviously the case with just about every type of an investing strategy that you deploy. It really comes down to the leadership, the operator, the team, that's managing the execution of whatever that business plan is. So I appreciate your perspective there. If you don't mind, Jacob, I'd like to get a little bit philosophical with you. And my question is, what does financial freedom mean to Jacob, and how has this journey through STR investing shaped that vision?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's pretty simple. I want to be able to do the things that I want without restriction. And financial freedom does not mean to me traveling the world, not working. It doesn't mean just kind of doing what I find most interesting or entertaining. I do think there's a lot more purpose involved, even in finding financial freedom. I just don't want the restriction around how I pursue my purpose to be derived or driven partially or fully by my need to make a living. And I know that sounds perhaps odd for somebody who's running a company and working hard, but I get a lot of passion out of what I'm doing. I get a lot of fulfillment out of it. And we didn't really talk about this, Jerry, but my background is kind of, my parents were with financial management. I've been around capital creation, capital preservation my whole life. And I've learned the value of a dollar my whole life. And I find that tremendously rewarding to continue to do. So financial freedom doesn't mean, I sit on my back and at the beach and just mountain bike and run all day, which are two things that I love to do. But it means being able to pursue my passions and my fulfillment without financial restriction.
Yeah, no, I so appreciate that. And obviously, financial freedom, means something different to, a lot of different people, right? It's not always about the dollars and the cents. The dollars and the cents obviously enable you to have other elements of freedom in your life, whether that's the freedom of time, the freedom of relationship, the freedom of location, the freedom of maybe you want to build a legacy for yourself, right? So there's a lot of different things that, financial freedom entail for the average individual. What would be maybe one or two different ways, Jacob, that our listening audience can learn more about, what you're up to and connect with you?
Yeah, I mean, the simplest way is, of course, go to our website, www.renjoy.com, or you can look me up on LinkedIn or X. I'm not super active, but I am on there almost every day. And so you can connect with me on social, on X, LinkedIn, or just go to our website. We're pretty frequently posting new content.
That's great. Well, Jacob, I've really appreciated your time today and the value that you've brought to our listening audience.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jeremy. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. And listening audience, thank you again for jumping into another episode of The Freedom Point. We look forward to having you join us on the next episode.
Thank you for hanging out with us today and for listening to the Freedom Point podcast, powered by Starting Point Capital. This show is for entertainment purposes only. Nothing said on this show should be considered financial advice. Before making any financial decision, please consult with a professional. This show is copyrighted by the Freedom Point podcast. Written permissions must be granted before syndication or rebroadcasting. If you're interested in connecting, you can find contact information at startingpointcapital.com.